Hello and welcome. I'm Nitin Gokhale and you are on my weekly show, Simply Nitin. And tonight, as promised, I'm going to talk to you about the Eelam War IV. Want to recall it with you, share my thoughts with you because I actually reported that war for NDTV when I used to work with NDTV in those years between 2006 and 2009. I was constantly, frequently in Sri Lanka to report on that war, which lasted from April 2006 to May 2009. But this period that I'm going to speak about, and you can see me atop armored personnel carrier going into the battlefield, bringing live reports for viewers of NDTV in that period. Now, the Eelam War IV happened between, as I said, between April 2006 and May 2009. The way I'm going to recall that war is this. There are 4 points that I want to make, that how it was different, why the war took place actually, why the war was different, what was the role played by big powers like China, Russia, India, Pakistan, and of course, the key element in that war was information operation and information warfare, when it was not a fashionable term to use. Today, information operation is big after 11 years, but that time, the Sri Lankan government and the Sri Lankan military utilized information operations, information warfare very effectively to choke information flow from northern areas of Sri Lanka where the LTTE was strong. So let me begin by telling you the background of the war. As many of you will know, this war was the result of a prolonged civil war or a civil conflict, a civil war between the Tamil Tigers, or called the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam, and other groups which started in 1983 and went through several phases of peace, war, and of course peace again, and then war. So therefore, this war, the final war, was called Eelam War IV. There was Eelam War I, II, III, which happened between 1983 and 2006. But the Eelam War IV began in April 2006 with the assassination attempt on then Army Chief General Sarath Fonseca. And that was the background. What was different in this war? Well, it was for the first time the military, the Sri Lankan military, got a very clear politico-military objective for the prosecution of the war. The political military objectives were spelled out clearly by the leadership. The president, then president of Sri Lanka, Mahinda Rajapaksa, who incidentally is the current prime minister, and he gave clear instructions to the military, gave them clear political objective that the LTTE must be banished, must be destroyed militarily, completely annihilated, or completely overcome. Now, having given that political objective, the Sri Lankan military was then empowered with proper equipment. Total backing was given to it, whatever they needed: arms, equipment, ammunition, intelligence. There was a total revamp of the security apparatus within the island nation. It was done by Gotabaya Rajapaksa, the younger brother of then President Mahinda Rajapaksa, who is now incidentally the president of Sri Lanka, who was elected as president of Sri Lanka in November 2019. That much change has come in Sri Lanka, that the wartime defense secretary, Gotabaya Rajapaksa, who backed the military totally along with his brother by giving them whatever they needed, by recruiting more manpower. Sri Lankan military went from about 100,000 total strength to about 250,000 in those 3 years between 2006 and 2009. They got modern equipment. There was endless supply of ammunition, and intelligence was revamped to an extent where the Sri Lankan military got the better of the LTTE. Of course, the other change that was there was the use of the Sri Lankan Navy for instance, which got to play a major role. There was synergy amongst all the three arms of the armed forces, Air Force, Navy, and the Army. The Army, of course, was the biggest factor. But unlike the previous wars, even the Air Force and the Navy played a major role in getting the LTTE under control initially, and then, of course, destroying it completely. The war was prosecuted according to the proper aim. The Navy came into play, as I said. This was something that the Navy had not done earlier in a big way. The Navy actually choked the supply of the Sri Lankans, and of course the LTTE rather, and just bottled them up in the northern areas of Sri Lanka. If you look at the map of Sri Lanka, and actually what was different in this was that this was the map I'm trying to show you, where the war actually took place between 2007 and 2009, the second phase of the war. The first phase happened in eastern Sri Lanka, around Trincomalee, Batticaloa, all that. From 2007 onwards, if you can see in the map, the forward defense line of the LTTE was that red line you can see at the bottom, was the forward defense line. Beyond, north of that, the LTTE was very powerful and dominant. But the Sri Lankan military approached northern Sri Lanka through different directions. It came from Mannar in the west, Anuradhapura in the central Sri Lanka, and finally kept pushing back the LTTE cadres, which numbered about 3,000 or more at that point in time. And then finally, that square or the rectangular shape that you see in east of this map is the place beyond Pudikiriyappu and near Mulaitevu, where the Sri Lankan, the LTT Supremo, Velupille Prabhakaran, was cornered and killed, along with his trusted lieutenants like Susai, his elder son Anthony, Charles Anthony. All these people were finally killed here on 18th of May. That is the reason why I'm speaking to you today, 11 years after what had happened in 2009. And but there were several factors that went into this, and there were help from other countries like China, Russia, India. Now, India's role is underplayed by the Sri Lankans at that point in time. China supplied it with weapons, with unequivocal support in the UN, in the United Nations Security Council. India, of course, publicly gave moral support, saying that we do not tolerate the terrorism in any form, be it Tamil terrorism or any other terrorism. But in secret, India actually helped Sri Lanka with intelligence. It helped also pinpointed accurate information about LTTE's weapon supply ships, which allowed Sri Lankan Navy to come into play and actually play a major role in preventing the LTTE from escaping from Sri Lanka itself. So many other factors went into it, not just the Sri Lankan military's role. Gotabaya Rajapaksa, who himself is a former infantry commanding officer of a unit before he left the army and the country in 1990, came back and he handpicked battle-hardened military commanders who had been blooded through the previous three wars of the country, the Eelam War 1, 2, 3. And Sharath Fonseca was a tough military commander. He was lucky to have the backing of the president, who was determined to end insurgency or civil war in Sri Lanka, and to have experienced military leader as defense secretary in Gotabaya Rajapaksa, who gave a free hand to the military, gave them an objective given by the, laid down by the president, and of course got this what I call the end result in demolishing the LTTE completely. As I'm speaking, I'm getting some questions here. Somebody's asked, Kamesh Singh has asked whether I'm going to take some questions. Yes, Kamesh, I will be taking questions. But let me come to the question that has been posed to me by Arijit Das. He says, why did India not publicly accept that it helped defeat LTTE? Now, well, you have to look at the prevailing political circumstances in those years when there was the UPA one in power, and it was completely dependent on the support from DMK in Tamil Nadu for survival in the parliament. And the DMK was in total support of the LTTE for the Tamil cause, and therefore India did not want to actually acknowledge its role in defeating the LTTE. Arijit, I hope I have answered your question there. But to move on, and of course, there's another question from Christo Matthews, who asked me a question: did the Sri Lanka government receive silent legitimacy from the West as well to wage such a brutal Eelam War, especially soon after 2006 Geneva Pact peace talks? Of course, it did. Let me tell you, despite reservations, and the later, kind of criticism that the US and the UK had, the United States actually helped Sri Lanka with a lot of intelligence, pinpointed intelligence, and allowed Sri Lanka to act against the LTTE arms suppliers, LTTE escape routes, Christo. Now, Kamesh Singh has asked me this question about LTTE, whether it was eliminated militarily, and what was the situation of Tamils. Well, I can't say they're at par with Sinhalese politically and economically. That divide still continues. But remember, these scars are 30-year-old, and therefore it will take time to sort of overcome those scars or heal those scars. But let me move on and tell you what exactly happened in that war, which I covered, which gave me an opportunity to see a battle up front and close. And that is what I want to tell you, that what was LTT's strategic mistakes? Why did why did it get defeated in this war and not the earlier two wars? Now, it made a big strategic mistake. LTTE was strong when it was a guerrilla force, when it would indulge in hit and run tactics and just melt into the jungles after hitting an army post or a military post. In this case, they became overconfident. They had expanded their force, and so they tried to act like a conventional army by holding territory, trying to hold territory. And exactly opposite tactics were adopted by the Sri Lankan military. Sri Lankan military, unlike conventional military operations, did not hold ground. They in fact acted like the LTT in the old days. They became the guerrillas. They employed 8-man teams to go into the jungles, live on their own, go behind enemy lines and destroy LTT supply lines or their ammunition dumps. They did that exact opposite. LTT also mistook or did not bother to read the kind of the army's tactics that were coming. They were new for them. LTT thought the Sri Lankan army is of the army of the old, which was lumbering, which was afraid. That wasn't the case. They did not anticipate the changed Sri Lankan army. LTT also did not foresee or did not take into account the changed international kind of atmosphere on terrorism, and it underestimated, most importantly, it underestimated the Sri Lankan Navy, which came up with tactics that were not sort of anticipated by the LTTE. For instance, the Sri Lankan Navy actually employed something called swarming tactics. They created small boats and went in like guerrilla forces to destroy LTT boats or LTT supply lines which were being carried on the sea. They choked the sea lines of communication for LTTE, and they went further than anybody could imagine to destroy the floating armories that LTTE used to keep on high seas. In one instance, I know of that the Sri Lankan Navy, after getting intelligence from India and the US, satellite information, went all the way near the shores of Australia in the Indian Ocean to destroy a floating armory of the Sri Lankan, of the LTTE, which actually weakened the LTTE as as the months progressed in the war. So therefore, I think LTTE made strategic mistakes. They kept too many people with them hostage, too many civilians. So as the Sri Lankan military advanced from west, from south, and from east, and from the north, the LTT got trapped. It hampered its movement because there were women, children, old people who could not be moved so fast. They thought they were hostages, but they actually impeded the movement, the swift movement of the LTT guerrillas, and therefore LTT paid a heavy price by keeping these civilians as hostage, because they had to feed those people. And of course, one major thing that the Sri Lankan military won was a media war. The Sri Lankan military, Sri Lankan government created a firewall around the northern areas of Sri Lanka. No information was allowed to escape from LTTE side. LTTE's information flow was completely choked. There were two reasons: they wanted to control and deny the information flow, which used to give LTTE the advantage and sympathy in international press. So local media was targeted, local media was controlled by the Sri Lankan government. The foreign international NGOs were expelled from the battlefield, which was not the case in the first three wars. But in this case, they were expelled from Jaffna, they were expelled from Kilinochi, they were expelled from Puducherry. So there was no information flowing out from the battlefield until it was verified and vetted by the Sri Lankan military or the Sri Lankan government. But the most important thing, a lesson for a media person like me, was that the Sri Lankan military thought far ahead. The Gotabaya Rajapaksa thought far ahead of his time and created something called the MCNS, the Media Center for National Security, which was a one-point communication center where information was provided, real-time information was provided to the media across the world. They had a huge functioning team that gave out information. But remember, it was a one-sided information. It was the information of the Sri Lankan military, of the Sri Lankan government. The LTTE had no way of breaching that firewall that was erected by the Sri Lankan government. And then it went completely mute, and therefore there was no support forthcoming from the international NGOs or international government or governments across the globe. That weakened the LTTE, unlike what it was in the earlier three wars. The fourth point was, of course, as I mentioned, that the atmosphere had changed across the world, or the feeling about terrorism had changed across the world, and therefore they had to accept what Sri Lanka was doing as a war on terror, legitimate war on terror. All the other big governments like Norway, who always used to do peacemaking efforts between LTT and Sri Lankan government, they were completely shut out of this thing. So media was controlled. 14 journalists got killed in various encounters or various accidents. 20 of them fled Sri Lanka. Those who were critical of the government at that point in time. The government said all is fair in love and war. They applied that adage and actually won that war in terms of media, perception management, and of course the kinetic war, the final brutal war that they won on 18th of May 2009. So this was in sum, the kind of things that happened. Of course, there are many other aspects to it. In this small, short program, one cannot pack in everything. I have actually written a book in 2009 called Sri Lanka from War to Peace. One can get into that book and see what happened. But one of the other advantages that the Sri Lankan military had was to create an information-rich website full of latest videos, pictures, and news, when it was not really thought about by any other militaries in the world, except for maybe US and UK in those years. Now every military has a website, every force has a website. So the result was that the Tamil Tigers, who used to use media, who used to use perception management and perception battle, they used to always win in the earlier previous editions of the battle or the war, were actually beaten by the Sri Lankan government at their own game. And that's exactly what weakened them, because they could not get any international sympathy or support. So that was something very different in this war that I happened to cover during those years. So going forward, I think I just want to take on some of those questions. I've got several. I can see there is Amit Mahabar in Marathi is asking me this question. Um, how did Sri Lanka actually spread outside the country, outside Sri Lanka, and has it ended completely? Has it been demolished completely? The answer to the second question is yes. At the moment, militarily, it has been decimated. It has been demolished. But who knows what happens in the future? If the Tamils continue to have the grievances that they've had for a long time, maybe another organization will come up later. Hopefully not, because the country cannot afford to have another civil war, another uncertain situation. He's also Amit Mahabal has a second question which he has asked: how did it expand outside the country? Who gave them arms and ammunition? So he's asked this in Marathi. I can read Marathi. That's why I'm reading this. There were so many countries covertly backing LTTE. Even India, remember, in the period between 1983 and 87, before IPKF went in, um, was helping and training the LTTE because India wanted to control and play a role during Rajiv Gandhi's time. And that's a separate episode that I had done earlier about recalling the IPKF's battles or IPKF's travels in Sri Lanka. But that's a different matter. That's how it happened. Let me take another question. Abhinav Pujar has asked almost similar question. Who was backing LTTE? Where did they acquire their arms and supplies? I just answered that they acquired it from different sources in Southeast Asia, from Europe, from even black market in China, Myanmar. So several sources, and they were backed covertly by some governments who wanted to keep the government on the edge, the Sri Lankan government on the edge. Somebody else has asked, Deva Chaudhary has asked me this question. So your book is not right now available on Amazon. Devo, let me tell you, I'm going to update that book, maybe rewrite and bring in what has happened over the last 10, 11 years, and also bring in some unknown aspects of that war. When I update or write a new book, maybe you'll have to wait for at least 6 months before that book comes out. But do look out for it when it comes out. I'll certainly inform you on all my social media platforms and handles that I have. There is Aditya Devgiri who's asked me this question. Can you tell us more about LTT Air Arm? Well, yes, LTT is perhaps the first insurgent group, a terrorist organization in the world which had acquired or had developed the capability of a small air force. But they had very small aircraft. They innovated. One thing one must give to LTT that they were very innovative in using tactics that nobody could think of. So they had small aircraft which would go into main land or southern Sri Lanka, and then had this whole atmosphere of fear created in Colombo and other places. So they did acquire that, but not too powerful a thing. As far as Swapnil Karmarkar is asking a question: do you think Sri Lanka indulged in human rights violations, and do you think some of the officers can still be held accountable? Well, certainly there are accusations, and during that kind of brutal war where civilians were kept hostage by LTTE and Sri Lankan military was advancing relentlessly, there are certainly cases of, I would say, excesses. But to call it human rights violation will be a travesty, because LTT, remember, was one of the most brutal and unforgiving kind of a insurgent organization, and therefore the Sri Lankan military had no other option but to indulge in some of the tactics that it indulged in. Of course, whether it can be held accountable, I'm not sure. Some governments still try. They have, remember, tried to blacklist the current Sri Lankan Army chief, Shavendra Silva, who is also the acting CDS there. Shavendra Silva was then a brigadier who had met in the war front. In fact, there are a couple of interviews that I had done with him when I was reporting for NDTV. He has been blacklisted. He has been prevented from going to the United States according to a notification. So therefore, there is an attempt still going on on those lines. But as I said, in war, all these things do happen. Let me take Manish Singh's question. But Manish, I have answered that question in a separate episode on Simply Nitin some weeks ago on IPKF. So therefore, you please go back and visit that, or maybe we'll talk on IPKF some another day. Ankit Arya has said, why did LTTE become anti-India? Well, there are different political reasons for it. You'll have to go back into history. Prabhakaran was not very happy for against India or with India for imposing the Indo-Sri Lanka Accord, which was not to his liking, and therefore they turned against India during the IPKF action between 87 and 1990. Before I answer two more questions from Christo and Kamesh Singh, I want to request you to like us on social media handles, follow us, subscribe us on our YouTube channels. Also, subscribe to our Twitter handle, or follow us on Twitter handle, subscribe to our YouTube channels, and also go to Instagram, send us feedback, keep asking questions. It's always good to engage with a live audience as I am doing it now. And I will come back to such episodes once a month, every month to begin with. This was the first time that we are doing this. Christo's question I must take before I go, and then of course Kamesh Singh. Christo says, is the plight of the Sri Lankan Tamils who are yet to get justice in Eelam War IV enough of an emotive topic in Tamil Nadu? Well, in some constituencies, yes, it will be. There are some politicians who will try and utilize this emotive issue with some of the electorates in some particular constituencies. But as a whole in Tamil Nadu, I think it's lost its relevance and traction. So it will only be useful in some constituencies. Kamesh Singh has said, in coming time, can this insurgency be again come to haunt peace in Sri Lanka? Well, God forbid it should not happen, and I don't think Sri Lanka will allow it. It has got systems in place, security apparatus in place, which is very effective, which will not allow the insurgency to come up again or create a civil war situation in Sri Lanka. So I think on this note, I would like to end this episode. We are nearing a 30-minute mark. Although Devo Chaudhary is saying next episode should be on Operation Parakram, we will consider that, Devo. But certainly, it's always a pleasure to come and engage with the viewers here. I'm not sure they are young, old, but they are certainly enthusiastic. They're certainly well informed to ask these questions. And let me thank you for this engagement. Very useful, very informative questions or very curious questions that you have asked. I'm happy to answer those questions, even if it's not live. But remember, I will come live every month, once a month from now on. So that means next episode of Simply Nitin Live will be in June sometime. We will keep you posted. So if you want to know when it will be, please follow us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and of course subscribe to our YouTube channels, both bharatshakti.in and StratNews Global. Until the next time, it's goodbye and good luck.